Welcome to this Sporting Heritage webinar, Practical Approaches to Oral History. We've only got an hour, and normally any training around oral history, for any of you who've had it before, would last a lot longer and it would be very, very interactive. So it's been quite a challenge to work out how we can get a good amount of content in and a bit of interactivity. We've got a very packed session, so we had anticipated that the presentation element will last about 40 minutes, but depending on questions and how it develops, we may go longer. So what we're proposing is that we leave as many of the questions as we can for a really good Q&A session at the end. But by all means, please add questions into the chat box. For most of the presentation, I'm going to pop everybody on mute so that Anita can do her delivery. But myself and my colleague Jo Boardman will be monitoring the chat and responding where we can. But we will save things for a Q&A at the end. And then if we do run over time, those of you who need to leave will have the option to go, or if you want to stay, you can. We will wrap up all the questions that go in the chat and send the answers through as part of the follow-up resources. So if you post something and you miss the answer, we will make sure that it is circulated. So obviously this is quite a strange time for trying to think about oral history interviewing, but Anisha and I have had lots of conversations in developing this session, and what sort of came back at the heart of it is this is a great time to be planning and thinking about how you structure your oral history and how you can really get a really rich interview out of your interviewees. And with that in mind, I will pass over to Anita, who is going to lead our session today. Over to you, Anita.
Right, hello everybody, nice to see you. I can see a few people. So just a tiny little introduction about myself, how I came to be looking at oral history and my interest in it. I'm going to share my screen now with my first slide, so bear with me while I just do that for a second. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah? Of course, I can't hear anyone now, so I'm going to have to look at a few nods. So I'm an oral historian. I do oral history training. I deliver lots and lots of workshops for people, whether it's community groups or schools, anybody who's interested in people. And that's really where I came to oral history, was my interest in people. The picture that I've put up here for you is actually me and not me, it's my mum and my grandmother. And that's what really sparked my interest. They both played in the same team together and played sport in the same team together. And it was their history that really got me first interested in other people's histories. I did a master's degree in 2012 in oral history and life history research. And within that program, I developed oral history workshops. So after completing that, I then carried on. You'll see from the little bit of information that I've put there is that I'm also a sports coach. So when we're talking about sport and reminiscence, there's a lot of work going on in that area. You know, I've covering all sorts of bases there with sports and oral history. So if we just move on quickly, because as Fran said, we really haven't got an awful lot of time. Normally my courses would be at least a day, if not 2 days, but I'm going to do a quick whiz through of some things that might be useful for you. And what I want you to think about is that this isn't going to be hard and fast rules. This is to give you things to think about and to consider and to help you explore further. So let's move right in. Okay, so the first thing you need to think about really with your interviewees and your interviews is why am I doing these interviews? What am I doing it for? The what and the why. Because that will frame how you do your interviews. Is it an academic oral history project? Is it memory gathering for an exhibition or website, as I've put there? It will tell you how you need to do your interviews, whether you need in-depth oral histories where you're going to be interviewing a few people over many sessions, or are you going to be gathering some information to highlight and illustrate your your exhibitions, or little bits of stories for your websites. It really does tell you how to do your interviews. So I'm not going to give you a set of rules here. It's a framework to see how you will do your interviews. If you filled in a funding application already, you'll already have decided this. You'll have decided whether you're going to have lots of interviewees, whether you're going to have a few select ones. So it really does inform your interviewing procedures. So for example, if you're doing an academic oral history project, or something that will be lodged with the British Library, for example, they have technical and cataloguing requirements that you need to follow, otherwise it won't work. So you need to check with your archive, or wherever you're going to lodge your interviews, what their requirements are. And that's really important. You know beforehand what their requirements are if you're going to be lodging your interviews with or depositing to an archive. So let's talk about interviewees. So we're moving very quickly through this, but let's talk about interviewees. How do you find them, and who do you ask? Well, you may have already got your interviewees lined up. It may be obvious for your project who you're going to interview, but what about people you haven't thought of? Sometimes we get so enmeshed in our projects that we think, right, I know exactly who I need to interview. I know exactly who I'm going to speak to. I know who's got all the stories. But there's always people that turn up that you didn't think about, or they've got a story that hadn't even occurred to you. So finding interviewees is, social media is the obvious big one. Your own network, your museum's network, your archives network, your club's network, all of those things are very easy. But think about also having events where you might attract different people to your project. Sometimes they're called conversation cafes, where you might have an open invite for people to come along, chat about whatever your project theme is, to chat about their memories and their experiences, and maybe even for them to bring along some artifacts or photographs that they can talk about. Try to get people talking. You can have your volunteers can be there, and they can be talking to everybody as well. And then you can kind of start to select people that might be interested in being interviewed for your project that you hadn't even thought of. It's quite a good one to widen your horizons on your project, and it opens up all sorts of avenues that you just may not have heard of. Talk to people in your network, obviously. There's always going to be somebody saying, do you know what, you should talk to Jo, she knows all the stories, she's got great memories, talk to her. People you hadn't even thought of. Also quite useful is to think about people who aren't normally interviewed on your subject or your project theme. Think about people who don't get to speak on this. So in oral history we often talk about unheard voices, people that don't get to talk. They may not come forward very easily. So think about people that wouldn't normally be interviewed on your subject or your project or your theme. Very often we can find that there are people that are interviewed all the time. You'll get the same interviewees coming forward telling you the same stories, but all of that is valid. But also think wider and think about who else you could include in your project that might give you some an interesting perspective that you hadn't thought about. Let's then, so top tips for oral history interviewing. Again, like I said, this isn't a set of rules. This is just a guide, and things that I've come to realize over the years of doing this. Just a few things to consider. All right, so it's not rules, but it is top tips, if you like, or my top tips. So I'm just going to read through some of them. Normally at this point we would have a class discussion, a workshop discussion, and we talk them through. But I'm just going to sort of whiz through the guide so that you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So excuse me while I'm reading through. Obviously, have a theme. You need a theme. Your project is your theme. You know, you need to know what you're going to be asking questions about. Sounds obvious, but you need to be able to focus in on what it is you want to ask questions about. Research is really, really important. Research your subject. This will help you ask intelligent questions, and it will also help to ask follow-on questions and to delve a bit deeper. Most of you, I'm sure, will have a huge wide overview of your project and your subject, but think about if you've got volunteers going out to interview people, which a lot of you will have, I'm sure. Make sure that everybody knows their subject so that they can ask intelligent questions and delve a bit deeper, because that's what you want. You want to delve into the answers that you're hearing. You need to have an interview guide. An interview guide is not a rigid set of questions. It's not a questionnaire. An interview guide is there really to help you if you get stuck, if you want to make sure to remember a particular question. It will be on there as a guide for you. It also helps to keep your interview on track. If you're doing a life story style interview and you want to start, you know, at the beginning, middle and end and all of those sort of things, it helps keep you on track so that you don't forget where you are in the interview. So we're jumping about a bit on here, but remove anything that's noisy when recording, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, so I'll leave that one. Something that people who aren't very experienced at interviewing forget to do is to introduce yourself. Introduce yourself and the project right at the start of the interview so that it's recorded, it's on the recording. It's recorded there for everybody to know. And don't forget the date that you're recording it. Obviously, a lot of this will come in later into your transcriptions and so forth, but set out what the project is about, who you are, who you're recording and when it is. To ask your interviewee to say their name, date and place of birth and where they live, perhaps. Ask simple questions at the beginning, and this puts your interviewee at ease, puts you at ease. It helps people hear their voice when they're speaking. It helps people settle into the interview. So don't pile in with a really deep and meaningful question. Just ask some simple ones to start with. So keep it simple and don't ask umpteen questions in one question, if you see what I mean. Ask one thing and allow your interviewee to answer that and then ask another thing. Try not to use leading questions. Sometimes you might hear people say, oh my goodness, it must have been so awful for you at that time. Well, that's a leading question. It might not have been awful for you at that time. Allow your interviewee to tell you about it rather than lead them into the answer you think you want or you think they will give. Which leads us into open questions. Unless you're fact-finding, try not to invite yes or no answers. Obviously, if you're fact-finding about when did you go to school at this particular school, and they said, well, 1953 or whatever it might be, that's not going to be an open question. But if you start the rest of your questions with things like, could you describe what it was like when? Or, that was really interesting. I'd really like to know a bit more about. Please, could you tell me about your memories of? And that opens up for them to tell you about their memories, rather than just a sort of series of quick answers. What you're trying to build is a picture and a story and a narrative. So allow people to expand and express themselves by the way you ask your questions. Don't interrupt. Try not to interrupt. You don't know what you might miss. When you interrupt, you stop the flow of thought of your interviewee. So let them have time. Don't interrupt. Pause. Don't be afraid of silence. It's quite a tricky one when you're interviewing somebody to leave that space. It feels like an eternity, but you will get good at it. If you haven't done this before, you will get used to doing it. But leave them space and time to think about their answer and to think about further thoughts before you jump in. Just on a technical point as well, if you're using your interviews to extract little bits of stories, it also gives you some useful gaps for editing. Just as a sideways note there. Look like you're listening. So when you're talking to an interviewee, it's very easy to forget it's not a conversation. So we'll be asking our questions and we'll want to join in. We'll want to laugh. We'll want to say, oh, really? Oh gosh, did you? But what an oral history interview is about is not you, the interviewer, it's about what the interviewee is saying. So be careful with your ums and your ahs and your reallys. And what you need to do is get really good at your non-verbal expressions. Okay, so lots of smiling, lots of nodding, and encouraging visually, so that people are reassured about what they're saying. Because if you just sit there stony faced, or you're looking around, or you're just thinking, oh gosh, what's the time, they're going to think what they're saying is not what you want to hear. So lots of encouragement. You can even try to develop your silent laughing. If you really want to laugh, you can do silent laughing just to join in, so that they feel reassured about what they're saying and what they're doing and what they're telling you. What you don't want on your interview is lots of noise from the interviewer, because if you're going to be using it for an exhibition or on your website, or for audio, for a soundscape, or to illustrate your exhibitions, whatever it is you're using it for, you don't want another person talking all over it. So you want a good flow of narrative. And most importantly as well, listen. You must listen carefully. I once heard a quote, I forget who it was now, but who said the 3 most important things about oral history interviewing is to listen, listen, and listen. So make sure you're hearing what the interviewee is saying. You're listening carefully. You want to pick up on things they're saying, and you want to be able to follow up on what they're saying, and you want to be able to do that carefully, interestingly, and intelligently, because that will make a much more interesting interview for you. Remember to thank the interviewee at the end of the interview. They've given you their time and their memories and their emotional input sometimes. You know, you never know what's going to trigger those emotions. So we need to be kind, we need to be friendly, and smile and enjoy it. So that's my few top tips. There's loads of others, I'm sure, that you'll find. But I think that we need to be very creative. We need to be creative with our questions, and that's a bit of a theme today. And we're going to look at that in our breakout rooms, is thinking about questions that are kind of less obvious. So there will of course be the questions that you need to get the nub of the story, but think also creatively around those questions in different ways that you might not have thought of before. Think about all the senses: smell, taste, sound, touch, sight. think about questions that ask people not only how it felt to be there, what did it sound like when you walked into the stadium? Tell me about the smells of the room, or, you know, I'm making this up, but you get my meaning, I hope. You know, how did it feel? How did the kit that they were wearing, what did it feel like? Is it different to now? Those sort of things. Try to think of ways to draw out extra details, I suppose is what I'm getting at. Encourage picture painting. Can you paint a picture for me of what it felt like, or what it was like when you walked into that room for the first time? And ask them to take you for a walk around. And that can sometimes trigger different memories and different ways of thinking about the story that they're telling you. Ask them to describe it as if they were there. So I think now we're going to move on to our group activity, and we're going to think about creative questioning. So we're going to use some breakout rooms. I don't know if you've all used breakout rooms before, but don't worry about it. Fran's got it all in hand. You're going to be allocated to a room and you'll receive an invite to join the room. We're going to look at this painting. It's a painting called The Alienist, or Alienist, by Richard Dadd in 1852. Well, I think it's a very evocative picture, and I hope it will give you a painting. I hope it will give you some help with thinking about questions in a different way. There's lots to look at, so be creative. Come up with everything you could think of in terms of what themes you could be asking about, what angles you might take, and what questions you might come up with. So should we give it a go? We're going to have 10 minutes on this, I believe.
Okay, so as Denise said, I'm going to pop everybody into a breakout room. You'll get an invite to join. If you click on the invite, it will pop you into a room. Anita will be looking after one room. I will look after another. And our colleague Joe Boardman will look after the third. We'll have a good amount of time to think of some creative questioning, and then I'll give everybody a minute's warning when we're all about to come back together. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to open all the rooms now.
The people that were in my room, Fran, are going to raise their questions rather than it be me do that. Okay. So when we ask.
Mm-hmm. Just wait for everybody to come back through, and I'll get Anita to share her screen so we've got the painting back up as well.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. We seem to have gone into our rooms and come out again seamlessly, which is great. I'm just waiting for Anita to come back, and I'll ask her to share her screen so that we've got the picture, the Richard Dad picture, and then we can have a little bit of feedback about those creative questions that you've come up with. Anita, are you there? I can't see you at the moment. Ah, yes. Anita, do you want to share your screen?
Yep,
So
are we all back?
Yeah, so we've got the Richard Dad picture again.
That went slide. This is where it all goes horribly wrong.
No, don't say that. Oh yeah, brilliant.
I'm in. Right, so I hope you all enjoyed that. In our group, we came up with lots and lots of different themes, lots of ways of thinking about things. And as somebody said in our group, it would help if we could research it a bit. And that's really absolutely what this is about. To highlight, if we knew a bit more about the painting, the person, the people, we might have some different questions to ask. And the same applies to your interviewees. So I'm just going to feed you a little bit of information. So if you remember, it was called alienist. I didn't know what an alienist was. It's a psychiatrist. So our Alexander Morrison is a psychiatrist. So we now know that bit of information. This is just off from Wikipedia about the so it was a simple search. Hat in hand, as if bidding farewell, Alexander Morrison, a pioneer of psychiatric medicine, stands before his estate in Newhaven, just north of Edinburgh. So it's in Scotland. Some of our group guessed it was in Scotland anyway. This portrait was painted at the end of Morrison's 17 years as consultant to Bethlehem Asylum in Surrey. So that's a useful bit of information if you were taking another angle. We did talk about, you know, how the building looked a little bit like perhaps a hospital or some sort of industrial place in our group. And then the artist, Richard Dad, was one of Morrison's patients. He'd murdered his father, believing him to be the devil. So that's a bit about the painter. We didn't actually talk about the painter in our group. That's another angle we could take, is who is this artist? He murdered his father before believing him to be the devil. Dad, that's the artist, hospitalised at Bethlehem, did not visit Scotland, but based this image on a sketch by Morrison's daughter. The two tiny women are fishwives, probably based on photograph. Now, I gave my group a little heads up here, and I'm not sure you'll be able to see it in this small screen. But did anyone notice the eerie face in the branch of the tree? Can anybody see that? You might have to download the picture to see it, but on the top branch, the crook of the trunk and the branch, there's a face. I don't know if it's a coincidence. It might be a coincidence, but anyway, who could it be? So there's all sorts of things in that painting to look at, and you might want to have a look at them at the painting another time. I really like it. So much to see and talk about in that painting. So moving on swiftly, she says, there it is. So basically all that was about creative questioning. Be creative. Think about unobvious questions that not everybody is asking, because interviewees tend to get asked the same questions all the time. So think sideways. What will your big question be? there might be something that you definitely don't want to forget to ask them. It might be something like, you might say, is there anything else that you'd like to say that we haven't covered here? You might say, what would the younger you tell the older you now? Just to finish off the interview and just to get some different perspective. So be creative and surprise yourself. I just like that picture, so I included that in my slides. So moving on from creative questioning then, bit more practicality. Where and how to interview. Where you interview people is important. Very often it will be in their own home, depending on your project, depending on your interviewees. And again, going back to the what and the why and the who, why you're doing it. If it's a really important, in-depth oral history interviewing project, you might even invite people to a recording studio or soundproof room. But mostly in community projects, in the kind of projects you guys might be working with or on, it would generally be either where your museum is or your archive is, or in the person's home. So make the room as quiet as possible. It is impossible to make it completely soundproof and silent. So there's just a few things to think about, like listening for ticking clocks or the fridge switching on and off, or people in other rooms. I'm sitting here in an attic room, and even with the double glazing, I can hear the traffic, and it would be picked up on the recorder, because recorders are very, very sensitive. So it's impossible to have it completely soundproof and silent. Just do what you can. Sometimes it helps to listen with your eyes shut. So if you're sitting in the room and you close your eyes and you just listen to the peripheral sounds and see if there's anything you can remove. There's some obvious things like clocks and that sort of thing, but just have a listen, because you won't realize that sound is happening until you listen back to your recording. So it's quite important to sit and listen in quiet, try and hear what's going on, and try and take those things out of the room. I've said keep the cat out. It's also dogs and anybody else, because a purring cat is actually really loud, or a sleeping dog, and whilst it's going on around you, you don't notice, and it's only when you come to listen back to your interview that you hear it. So just be aware and do what you can. So in terms of microphones, I'm using a lapel mic. I don't know if you can see it. If I lean forward, there you go. I'm using a lapel mic. That's really useful because it means that you can get it close to your interviewee, and it takes it closer to the interview and further away from the interviewer. If you're going to be using a recorder, don't hold it in your hand, because the sound of you fumbling around with the recorder and holding it, and let's face it, if you're doing an hour-long interview, you don't want to be holding a recorder for an hour. Plus you'll have other things to do. You'll be looking at your notes, or you'll be taking notes, or you'll be checking your equipment, you know, all sorts of things going on. You don't want to be holding a recorder. If you're not using a lapel mic, put your recorder on a tripod or a mic stand or something, but make sure that it's closer to the interviewee than to you, because the important thing is that you hear the interviewee and what they're saying. Let's move on to equipment. Talked a little bit there about some kind of equipment. There's so much choice. You find people using all sorts of equipment these days because the quality is really good. Phones, for example, but again, you must be careful to check with whoever you're going to be depositing your interviews with, what their requirements are. because you need to be recording, ideally, on a recorder that can record in the WAV format, WAV format, and that's the most accepted quality standard of recording for archives. You can then convert your WAV recording to MP3, but you can't do it the other way. So the highest quality is WAV, and that's what most people will want. They are huge files. When you record them, they're huge. You can then save them in MP3 and compress them and all of those things. Again, goes back to knowing what your interviews are for. So as I say, lots and lots of choice. I use a Zoom. Quite coincidentally, it's called Zoom. Nothing to do with the company that we're using today. So that's a Zoom H1N. Really simple, and ideal for volunteers who aren't that au fait with using recording equipment. It's a simple on-off. It has automatic recording levels, all sorts of things. Records really high quality in WAV and MP3, but as I say, there's so many others to choose from. That's a very simple one, and in the scheme of things, relatively inexpensive. We also use a Zoom H4N, which happens to have 4 tracks, a little bit more complicated. But all of them, you can plug in external mics and all of that sort of thing. I'm actually using my Zoom recorder today to speak to you through my lapel mic. There's all sorts of uses. And as I say on this slide here, always record at the highest quality possible. Transcription, moving on to transcription. All oral histories should be transcribed in some way or another, and again, you must check with whoever you're depositing your interviews to, which archive you're using, because they will have their own requirements and ways of doing things. It's a huge subject. I'm not going to spend too long on this because it just goes on. It takes a lot of talking about, but basically you can transcribe your interviews verbatim, word for word, but at least it must be a timed summary. So you can go to a time point and know where the information is. And just as a heads up, it takes at least 1 hour to transcribe 15 minutes of audio, at least. So it's quite a involved process, and sometimes people get their volunteers to do the transcriptions, people that haven't done the interviews. I prefer to do my own transcription because I can hear it more carefully. I can listen back to things that I might have missed, that I might want to follow up, that I might want to revisit and go back to the interviewee and say, I really would like to know a bit more about this. Also, when you're transcribing your own interviews, you know the nuances. You will have seen the sort of raised eyebrows or the wry smile when somebody said something which somebody who hasn't done the interview might not have picked up, and when they're transcribing, so they might not be able to pick it up from the audio, is what I mean, in order to transfer it to the transcription. So I'm just going to round up here. In summary of what we've been talking about, or what I've been talking about, is know why you're doing your interviews, know what they're for and how you want to use them. Be curious, be interested in the people, be able to think sideways with your questions, do your research, really, really important. Creative questioning, again, we talked about a lot about that earlier. Ask questions that they're not expecting, that they haven't been asked before, that are just a little bit out of the ordinary. Listen carefully, listen to what the person is saying to you. Smile and enjoy it. It's supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be it's not supposed to be a difficult process, but it can be quite scary. But if you do all of these things, you should be able to get through it well. Couple of last things. Please do visit the Oral History Society website. It has pretty much every eventuality on it. Brilliant website, very, very detailed. It holds all sorts of information that you know is so valuable. And join the Oral History Society. Don't forget your consent forms. We didn't talk about that earlier because there isn't time to talk about everything, but you can't use your interview without a consent form. There are consent forms on the Oral History Society website. Remember to take photographs. So you're at your interview. It's really nice to have a visual representation of the person you're interviewing. We haven't talked about video oral histories because that's a whole other subject, but please take some photos. It's really good to have photographs. And then try to leave some time, once you've finished your interview, try to leave some time to have a chat with your interviewee. Bear in mind that they've invested time and a lot of emotional energy in an interview. You may have talked about some things that they've never talked about before. You may have done. Just give them some time. Don't just, right, thanks very much, I'm off now. And it's a good way to leave them with a good impression of your project and your theme, and that you've treated them kindly and respectfully. But one thing I will say is be prepared for them to start telling you stories that you wish were on the recording. So you might want to start the recording up again. But that's enough from me, I think. And thank you for listening. I think it's back to Fran.
Lovely, thank you, Anita. That's been a really good coverage. Do you want to stop screen sharing so we can see everybody just for a moment? There have been a couple of questions that have come up in the chat, but there's one topic, so thank you, Helen, for posting those. There was one topic that I wanted us to touch on as well, and that's undertaking oral history interviews while we're not quite in the strict lockdown that we were, but during this COVID period. Would you recommend people actually conducting interviews now? What's the general feeling about interviewing at the moment? Yeah,
it's a tricky one because things are changing all the time. The last advice that I read, which was from the Oral History Society, was to perhaps wait, is to delay a bit, do your planning now, do your preparation and wait, because it's quite difficult to do an interview over Zoom or Skype or whatever it might be. In terms of you know, the lockdown easing, you know, there's not so many restrictions now on people meeting, depends where you are, of course. But the general overview so far has been delay your interviews.
So better to do it when you
face to face. Yeah.
And I suppose that establishes a better rapport between you and the interviewee. Is that sort of the thinking and the nuance that you can pick up that you don't get in a
it really does. And you know, there's nothing like interviewing face to face. There's nothing like it. But things are changing all the time, so it's going to move. It's going to move. You might be in an area which is on local lockdown, in which case you can't anyway. You know, so it's just a case of seeing how things change.
Lovely. Right, let's just pick up on the questions in the chat, if I could just bring it all
I think
up.
somebody's just posted about interviewing.
Oh yeah, so thank you, Michael, for putting on there the blog from NCL. And just going back to Helen's questions.
Sorry, Fran, just one thing I forgot to say was interviewing over Zoom or however else is better than not interviewing at all. If you think you might miss that interview for whatever reason, do it anyway. You know, get it recorded over Zoom. You know, if you think waiting 6 months might mean you don't have the opportunity of interviewing that person, do it. However you do it. Sorry.
Yeah, That makes sense. So just going back to Helen's questions, Helen has asked, how long a recording can you do on one of your Zoom recorders? Is there a time limit?
No, well, there is if you're recording on WAV, but it's about 3 hours on that Zoom H1. I always get the letters around it. Yeah, H1. The simple little one, I think it's about 3 hours on WAV, but on MP3 it's about, depending on, because you can choose different qualities of MP3 as well. So it you know, it can be upwards 13, 15, 20 hours. So there's a lot you can fit on to a little Zoom recorder. You'll have more storage on the H4n, and it's got memory cards that go in it, so you could replace it with another memory card. But WAVs are big files. They are very big files.
And how long would you recommend? I know it depends on your interviewee, but for a one sitting for an oral history interview, would you recommend that you sort of sit down for like a 3 hour period, or is it better?
I wouldn't. No, the recommendation is kind of 1 to 2 hours at the most. Most people are getting tired by, you know, after an hour, because if you think about, you know, you interviewing somebody, the interviewee is putting a lot of emotional energy into this, and a lot of thought and a lot of time, and again, also it depends on the age and ability of the person that you're interviewing. Some people can handle it for longer, some people can't, and you'll soon notice when your interviewee is starting to flag. You will notice, and it's best to come back, you know, come back another time. If there's more to talk about, come back another time, rather than extending the length of the interview, in my experience anyway.
And Helen also asked about the permission form. So as you said, they're all on the Oral History Society website. And is there examples of transcriptions and time transcriptions? Are there sort of samples so people can see the format of there as well?
I don't think, I haven't got the book in front of me. I don't think there are actually on the Oral History Society. There will be, I'm sure there's some. No, I'm not sure about that. Sorry about that. I'm not sure.
Maybe we can have a chat afterwards and maybe send out some examples with the follow-up resources.
Yeah, I've got a book that I've got a whole list of books here to hand to send out. The titles of, one of which is a transcription book. Really good. So I would.
Well, let's put something together as a follow-up.
Yeah.
So other questions. Carol said, do you have any advice on sources of funding for a small local oral history project? She's thinking of proposing one to her local history society. So are there good places that support oral history projects?
Yeah, I think it's really anybody and everybody. You know, it's looking around to see who's funding at the moment, and I can't really answer that because it's so different for different areas. But when I've done a sporting oral history project, for example, I went to the lottery funding. So I think there are local pots of funding, but I think it's more about how you put your project together, and you know, and look up on in East Sussex. We've got a really great resource that comes out from East Sussex County Council, which brings together all the local funders and national funders. It's a really good newsletter, and they you know, you can then look in to see what those people are funding. That's quite a tricky one to answer, sorry.
Yes, I think any project that has a high level of community engagement, which hopefully an oral history project would, then going to any of the lottery funding strands would be probably a good place to start. I know that on the Sporting Heritage website there is a funding database which is supported by Community Matters Yorkshire, and they're fantastic. John at Community Matters Yorkshire will do updated funding on there, so you can, if you're looking for a project funding, that would be a good place to start as well. But you can always come back, particularly if it's something linked to your Sporting Heritage collections, you can always come back and speak to one of us at Sporting Heritage, because we're looking at funding all the time. And we can quite often, if you're struggling to find funding, maybe point you in the right direction of a couple of pots as well.
Yeah, funding isn't my level of expertise, I'm afraid.
Joe, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say on the fund. Yeah, I was just going to say on the funding. Just bear in mind at the moment that none of the major lottery funders are going to be reopening their normal programs until 2021 because they're all doing the emergency and recovery funding programs. So Arts Council obviously has got project grants open. There is the Art Fund. There's also the Collections Fund as well. And I don't know if TNA is still doing something as well at the National Archives. So there are little pots out there. And Carol, I don't know if you're already signed up to it. I'm sure you are. But Museum Development Yorkshire, when they do their newsletters, they tend to list funds as well as obviously the information that comes out with Sport and Heritage. And I'm trying to think of the fund. I get lots of funding newsletters, so I tend to get lots of them nationally and locally. Depending on where you're thinking about, Carol, as well, your local community foundation will provide you with funding updates as well. So if it's Leeds based, then obviously Leeds Community Foundation. But yeah, and talk to the team at Sporting Heritage and John at Community Matters Yorkshire as well.
Thanks. That's all good. That was all really helpful. Thanks. And what you said, Anita, about the local council look there as well. Thank you very much.
I'll pop some links to good sort of starter places to look for funding on the resources. Brilliant. So I think that's gone through most of our. I think that's gone through our questions. Anything else anybody would like to ask? Oh, I have one message. So, anything else before we wrap up? Well, we're 3 minutes over, which was really good. We had a lot of content to crack through. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Anita for leading the session today, and thank you everybody else for taking part. And I hope that it's given you some things to think about with your oral history planning, those of you who've had a bit of experience and those of you who are about to embark on this area of activity. I will send round the link for the recording and Anita's slide deck. And a list of follow-up resources which will include Anita's top tips and other things that we've talked about, so links to the Oral History Society website, some of the funding bits that we've talked about, and there will be the absolutely obligatory evaluation link form which everybody will be required. Please do take a moment to fill in our evaluation so that we can continue funding these webinars and hopefully offering them for free in the future. So I'd like to close there, so thank you very much. Have a great day, whatever you're doing this afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.